So welcome everybody. The last time that I welcomed you, I was actually welcoming you to the For Life Center, which is where I was sitting last time, but I've decided for the sake of safety to do the presentation from home this evening. So the For Life Center is a space which I opened about 3 months ago, which is the culmination of a lifelong dream to have a performing arts center as a space for professional, personal, and community growth and upliftment and development. What became added to that dream in recent years was that the space should also be a physical and spiritual home for what I call Logotheatre, a term which I will explain more about a little later. But first, I'd just like to go back quite a number of years to the start of how I came to have my first encounter with logotherapy. Many years ago, back in the 80s, I was studying drama at the University of Cape Town, and I encountered psychodrama, in which I became very interested, and my lecturers at the time suggested that I should perhaps combine some psychology studies with my performing arts studies. But being 17, 18 years old and hugely ambitious, I was not going to water down my field of focus, and also being 17 or 18, I believed that I had a never-ending time spreading out ahead of me at which I would be able to study psychology. So of course the years went by, and when I finally did go, now I would like to study psychology, I was in my 40s, I had a family, I had a very high-powered and time-intensive job in television, and studying a psychology degree was just not something that was going to fit into the time that I had available. So I started looking around for short courses that I could really just explore kind of fairly casually to just satisfy my interest. And I discovered logotherapy. I'd never heard of it before. And I do really, really believe now that that logotherapy came to me because it has had the most profound effect on my life, on my personal life, and indeed on my professional life, which is really what this presentation is largely about. So in those days, the courses were still at UNISA. So I started my introductory and second course there in UNISA, at UNISA. Unfortunately, I then, when I got into the clinical section of the course, which was working with clients and having to transcribe sessions, which, as we all know, is extremely time-consuming, I just found I was not managing to keep up with it, and I had gave up a few years ago. And then I lost my television job about a year and a half ago in the middle of COVID. Simultaneously also decided to return to my passion, which is the theatre, which of course, as you all know, the theatre died a very rapid and very traumatic death because of the pandemic, which we are still trying to recover from. And so I realized that I had time at my disposal to once again start exploring logotherapy, and that's when I returned to picking up my advanced studies, which I completed fairly recently. And I'm now currently busy with my diplomate professional studies. I've just started working on my research project, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But to go back to the beginning of when I started studying logotherapy under Dr. Chantal at the University of South Africa, I realized quite early on in those studies that logotherapy provided a wonderful blueprint for life and living. And simultaneously, I realized that while I was training and directing actors, my approach was also providing them with a kind of training for life and living, which extended beyond their craft. So in the process of looking for something to replace my career in the performing arts, I had instead been guided towards something which would actually enhance it, as well as provide me with a supplementary task to which my existing professional experience could bring depth and purpose. So during the many years of my career as a performing arts practitioner, I've been in the theatre and television industry for 42 years now. I've acquired very particular beliefs about the nature of performance and the approach to acting. These beliefs have shaped and developed the exercises, methodologies, and techniques I make use of in my directing and teaching work with both young and seasoned performers. In a nutshell, I do not believe that acting can be a process of becoming someone else, which is usually the answer I get when I ask young people who want to study acting. And the first thing I say to them is, what does acting mean to you? And very often they say it means becoming someone else. Now, first of all, that's actually absolutely impossible. But I also believe that rather than becoming something else, acting is a process of creating from the only available instrument of expression to the actor, which is the self, very much for me with a capital S. And this encompasses the physical, the psychological, and most importantly, although I did not realize that at the time, the spiritual self, which is dissected, examined, and repackaged as the self of the character being portrayed, and which can only be evolved from the actor's own physical, psychological, and spiritual self. The physical, psychological, and spiritual activities and processes which human beings undertake and undergo, many of them unconsciously or subconsciously, sometimes thousands of times a day, breathing, moving, thinking, imagining, making choices, experiencing emotions, etc., etc. So while I was aware during all my years of being a theatre, television director, and an acting trainer, while I was very aware of working on initially the physical and psychological levels of humanness with actors, I had no names for most of the exercises, techniques, and processes which I was developing for this self-focused acting training and development. However, I realized when I started studying logotherapy that I had in fact always employed Socratic dialogue as my mode of communication in directing and teaching. My method has always been to elicit the discoveries and the choices from actors through posing questions rather than by imposing external interpretations of my choosing onto them. Similarly, in working through emotional blocks and issues of self, which training actors battle with, I had unknowingly been working with the principles of hyper-reflection and dereflection, and in some cases even with paradoxical intention. Frankel's tragic triad of suffering, guilt, and death, all of which are found in the experiences of characters in great drama, and his neurotic triad of depression, aggression, and addiction, states which are also frequently explored in drama, are almost a guide for actors who are serious about getting to grips with the nature of human behavior, its origins and manifestations. The exploration of creative, experiential, and attitudinal values, whilst I did not know that was what they were called, has always been at the core of my training and direction through the exploration of the self and the parallel development of techniques such as acting techniques such as visualization, emotional recall, tension of an internal conflict, etc., etc., etc. So several years after encountering logotherapy and completing my first two modules of study, I moved from the city to the beautiful Riebeek Valley, here where I live now, some 80 kilometers from Cape Town with my family. And although I had paused my studies at that time due to time and other constraints, it was here that I stumbled across the first opportunities which started to marry my knowledge and skills in drama and logotherapy through training, entertainment, and healing initiatives. I launched an open-air amphitheatre in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic in order to help save my devastated industry through providing work for performers and safe live theatre experiences for audiences. I started to work with a depressed poet, and I formed a community performing arts initiative, which grew out of the fact that on arriving in the valley, I was struck by the large amount of racism, exclusivity, and diversiveness which still exists here. The village of Riebeek, which is in fact the next village along from where I live, is literally still divided by a railway line above which the wealthy business owner white people live, while the impoverished colored community lives below the line, to where it was forcibly removed from above the line in the mid-1960s. And my response to these issues was to form this aforementioned community arts project called the Olive Branch Project, which seeks to bring about healing between communities through collaboration on performance projects. Several months after this and starting this community program, I was introduced to a wonderful local Afrikaans poet by the name of Herman Jonker, who suffers very severely from Hashimoto's disease, one of the symptoms of which is a debilitating depression, which had resulted in him almost living the life of a complete hermit. He was keen to explore expressing his poetry in spoken words instead of merely writing them down, and so I started to work with him at his home. It soon became clear that he had a great talent for performing and vocal interpretation, and that the work I was doing with him was starting to bring him back to life. Recognizing the logotherapeutic possibilities in the situation, I introduced him to Man's Search for Meaning, which he immediately read, and to Viktor Frankl, with whom he became fascinated. Cutting a long story short, I have been able to, through finding meaning, assist Herman into a new stage of his life. He now calls himself, rather just as a poet, he calls himself in Afrikaans an actieve woordkunstenaar, an active word artist, which means that he not only writes his work down, but that he actually goes out into the world and shares it personally with people, which is something that has been an extraordinary development for him, from somebody who was actually unable to even really interact one-on-one with a human being in his own home. He's now able to actually go out into the world and share his work in very exposing and emotionally vulnerable situations. He now goes under the name Jonker Jonker, and he and I have created 3 theatre pieces together and are about to embark on a 4th. Herman still suffers from and battles with depression, but he is no longer in a state of inactivity and despair. He has started to venture out into the world again, and even to begin a relationship with a woman, all because he has found meaning in his life due to the combination of theatre and logotherapy. Just as a kind of sidebar issue to this, drama therapy, along with other visual and performing arts-based therapies, is well represented in the field of psychotherapy, as we know. However, my research has revealed that there's been little or no exploration of logotherapy specifically being combined with drama to create a meaning-based approach to healing through artistic application. Similarly, while I've frequently come across the exploration of psychology and psychotherapy for use in the teaching of acting technique and professional actor training, examples include Freud and psychodynamic approaches to personality, Adlerian individual psychology, and the study of various psychological disorders, nowhere have I found a logotherapeutic component to any acting training or performance methodology. So in the therapeutic environment, this is on the one hand not surprising, given that logotherapy does not make use generally of one of the major techniques in psychodrama, which is role play. But it's also interesting that the only therapy which truly addresses the spiritual dimension of human beings has been ignored when it comes to employing that most spiritual of human activities, artistic expression and creation, in the treatment of disorders which frequently have their basis in existential and other crises of the spirit. Something I've found is that performing artists often have a better developed will to meaning, even when it is not fully realized, as seeing themselves as the interpreters and messengers of the stories of the human condition. Their sense of calling and purpose is frequently more evolved than that of many people who do not perceive their careers to be of significance to society. Again, it is interesting that a logotherapeutic component has never been explored in relation to the training and development of a highly spiritually evolved skill set, which frequently does draw on other forms of therapy for enhancement. And that's how I came to develop this term, which is of logotheatre. Logotheatre being a new term coined during the course of my logotherapy advanced studies, and a field of developmental research which is current and ongoing. The term refers to the study, practice, and application of the synergies, mostly spiritual, between the philosophy, principles, and techniques of logotherapy and artistic performance, with applications of logotherapy to actor training and acting in the encounters between teacher or director and student or performer, which are then mirrored in the logotherapeutic encounter between therapist and client. It is also hoped that logotheatre will represent a development in the field of drama therapy, where little application of the principles and techniques of logotherapy has been implemented thus far. So just a little bit about my professional diplomate research project, for which I've just submitted the abstract, which I'm very happy to say has been accepted by Dr. Chantal and Sean Waters. Thank you very much. So now I have to get down to the hard grind of writing it. So this research project will explore the following hypotheses. The first one being that the performing arts as creative and experiential values have the power to elicit meaning in the lives of those who practice them, both professionally and non-professionally. And secondly, that theatre and drama have the power to elicit meaning from audiences through extending the boundaries of the intimate face-to-face counseling session to the wider world. And thirdly, that the philosophy, principles, and techniques of logotherapy are powerful tools in the pursuit of honesty, truth, and the expression of the simultaneously unique and collective human experience, which are fundamental to the training and performance processes of actors. So my ongoing and current research opportunities, which I have at my disposal in my professional work in the theatre and in my work at the For Life Centre, are the following. I have adult group acting classes. I have individual acting sessions. I have a youth group acting class. I have individual youth group acting sessions. I'm in the process of developing some performing arts bridging courses, which is identifying talent here in the area which I live, which is a rural area, where those talents often, well, they don't have the opportunity of being exposed and being seen, and being taken into a good tertiary performing arts training institution. So I'm developing bridging courses which will identify highly talented youngsters and upskill them in terms of language, communication skills, frame of reference to the arts, et cetera, to enable them to be taken into tertiary institutions in Cape Town and to go on to create meaningful careers in the performing arts, locally and possibly even internationally. I then obviously also have my individual logotherapy clients who I'm working with on an ongoing basis under the supervision of Dr. Chantal. We run an anxiety and depression support group at the center, which is also forms part of the research focus. My daily program of performing arts classes, the ones which I give are obviously built around acting, but also we include, we have music, we have dance, we have steel band, all of which I really believe that involvement, particularly of young people from disadvantaged communities in the performing arts, is a really superb conduit to meaning and purpose. And we're seeing this to a great extent where young people who come from very, very badly broken homes, where they encounter a lot of addiction, drug and alcohol abuse, gender-based violence, et cetera, are finding, at least for some time of their day or week, a kind of haven at the center where they are able to practice the things that they're becoming passionate about, the music that they're learning, the techniques that they're learning in acting, singing, dancing, etc. There are also then two productions, community productions, which I'm developing, one being built around Romeo and Juliet, which explores the nature of diversity and hatred, which is bridged by the greatest of all of the experiential values, which is love. And then we're also doing a play called Last Man Standing, which is about the last man to remain in his house when the bulldozers were approaching during the forced removals here in the Riebeek Valley during the 1960s. And one of the great things we're doing here is employing that great logotherapeutic tool, which is humor, where despite the fact that we're dealing with an extremely traumatic subject, and some of the people who survived this forced removal are still alive and part of this project, but we have found in working with them such a wonderful sense of humor, which we're actually exploiting in the writing of this piece. And as much as it's hard hitting and dealing with a tragic event, there's a lot of humor and laughter in the piece, which is making it accessible to people. And also, I do believe, also assisting with the healing process of many of these survivors as they come towards the end of their lives, having been forcibly removed from their homes nearly 60 years ago. And then I'm going to spend the majority of the rest of my talk on a workshop which I have actually already completed in the process of my research, which was a workshop which I did last year in September in Cape Town at a very high-end performing arts institution called the Leighton Alexander Musical Theatre Academy. And so I'd like to go through how that workshop actually functioned, what what I'd hoped to get out of it, what the results were, and why I feel that this is enabling me to move forward with the research project. So the process of this workshop was built entirely around the principles of the principle of the Socratic dialogue, the most important of the techniques used in logotherapy. What was being tested here was to what extent actors are able to self-intuit and self-discover what they require for their creative process. The goal was for them to reach the point of self-realization that everything they require for their work lies within them, that the self is the only instrument of expression and of living available to them, and that all the answers they require are to be found, as is meaning, within their own physical, psychological, and most importantly, spiritual dimensions. The difference between the use of the Socratic dialogue in this workshop and a logotherapy session was that in the latter, nothing is planned. Obviously, the questions posed arise spontaneously out of the moments and the logo hints and other meanings perceived and received by the therapist from the client through a process of deep listening and observation. For this workshop, however, there was a series of prepared questions for each of the modules. My hope was that only one or two of these questions would be required to get the ball rolling, after which the process would revert to something more akin to a logotherapy session, in that further questions would start to arise spontaneously out of the moments and the processes of deep listening and observation. The planned scripted question structure for each module consequently only consisted of a few carefully considered sentences. Applications of other logotherapy techniques, dereflection and paradoxical intention, were explored in relation to emotional and other blocks to creativity, most particularly the paralyzing effect of negatively channeled fears and nervousness on artistic expression, and the self-defeating hyper-reflection on perfection and getting it right, which is something that many artists suffer from. The truth that every logotherapeutic encounter between therapist and client, in fact, every moment in each of those encounters is entirely unique, is equally true of the various encounters which actors have in their training, rehearsals, and performing processes. Each encounter with the self, fellow actors, director, writer, character, and ultimately each audience member must be completely unique in order to achieve what acting basically means, which is to make the practiced and rehearsed appear completely spontaneous. This notion of the unique encounter, such as we experience it in logotherapy, is also central to the themes and outcomes of this workshop. A personal goal for myself in this workshop was to resist my natural inclination to solve problems and provide answers, which I've learned to my detriment in both professional and personal contexts are shortcuts to compromising the truth required by a situational choice. My aim was to develop my skills at utilizing the Socratic dialogue spontaneously to elicit truth and meaning in my work as a director, acting coach, and logotherapist. The second section of the workshop turned the focus from the actor to text and character and examined the potential of applying logotherapeutic principles, techniques, philosophies, and beliefs to the process of text analysis and character creation and development. I went backwards and forwards in preparing for this workshop around the choice of whether or not to draw the parallels between logotherapy and artistic creation and expression throughout the course of the workshop, or to engage the students unconsciously with the techniques and processes and only point out the parallels, overlaps, and synergies purely for the sake of their interest, my research outcomes would have been realized or not, at the very end of the session. I finally opted for the latter, as my sense was that if the students were aware that they were exploring parallels, they were more likely to attempt to do the right thing rather than simply engage with the dialogues and exercises. So in logotherapeutic terms, the workshop could potentially be sabotaged by hyper-reflection on the part of its participants on the outcomes, rather than on staying in the moment, which could be the only way that the truths of the research would be revealed, was my realization and conclusion. I worked with a group of first-year students at the Leighton Alexander Musical Theatre Academy, which is housed in Peter de Reen's Theatre on the Bay in Cape Town. Whilst guest teaching the second and third-year students a few months prior to this workshop, I had experimented with some of my ideas and exercises, which I then developed further for the workshop. I then specifically requested a group of 8 students with whom I had not worked before and asked for a diverse cross-section of gender, race, gender identity, and sexual orientation, which they very kindly gave me. So the workshop itself was then divided into several modules. I started, as one always does, working for a day of start preparing for a day of rehearsal in the theatre with a top-to-toe physical warm-up, a breathing, speed vocal warm-up, an opening, a visualization exercise, and some focus exercises, just to ensure that the students were absolutely in the moment, and that they were physically and mentally and spiritually in tune with the instrument, that being the instrument both of self-expression, of creative expression rather, and of living. What I started exploring first and foremost then was the notions of meaning and purpose. And the inciting questions which I structured to get the ball rolling in this discussion were, what does meaning mean to me? What gives my life meaning? Was my decision to study to become a performing artist meaning-based? How does being a performer add meaning to my life? And what are my moral responsibilities and or duties as a performing artist? And the logotherapeutic applications that I felt I was exploring in this section were the freedom of will to meaning in life, creative and experiential values, filling the existential vacuum, and responsibility and meaning. The second module then dealt with the instrument, the self as the instrument of both artistic or creative expression, and also the instrument of living. And the inciting questions there were, what are the visual artist's instruments or mediums of artistic or creative expression? What are the musician's instruments of artistic or creative expression? And what is the performing artist's instrument of creative expression? The self, whereas the visual artist works in conjunction with the medium they are working in, the paint, the palette, whatever medium they may be sculpting in, and the musician works in conjunction with a musical instrument. The performing artist's instrument is purely the self, the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, the psychological self. And then what dimensions exist within that instrument, and that being particularly the physical, psychological, and spiritual, obviously under which there are many subheadings and to be explored. The logotherapy applications I was looking at there were applying the concepts of the open vessel and physical, psychological, and spiritual dimensions of both living and healing. The third module in the day I entitled Know Thyself, and acting as the unique encounter. And so the inciting questions were who am I physically? Who am I psychologically? Who am I spiritually? And how does my conscience guide or sit in judgment of who I am? And then lastly, with whom do I have unique encounters in the course of my processes as a performing artist? The logotherapy applications that I was exploring there were the notion of the unconscious God, the attitudinal values, attitude modulation, which is more one of Elizabeth Lucas's developments, but one which I find very, very fascinating. And the notion of the logotherapeutic notion of fate versus freedom, very much in relation to the self that I had been blessed or cursed with. And obviously the area of fate, I have this body, my body looks like this. I may be able to change it in some ways through changing my hair color, going on a diet, putting on weight, losing weight, and even through plastic surgery in extreme cases. But basically, this is the instrument I'm stuck with. Likewise, who am I spiritually and who am I psychological? That is what I have to work with. And very much the process for me in terms of acting is about making peace with this instrument. If you hate your body or a certain part of your body, that is an instrument that is going to be looked at by millions of people. And if you're going to be trying to hide part of it away, that's going to be a problem. Likewise, to recognize something in your psychological or spiritual makeup, which is something you may not like about yourself, the darkness which we all have within us. We can't hide that as an actor. That is a tool in the actor's toolbox, which needs to be brought out into the light and examined and expressed in the process of performance. Likewise, I believe in logotherapy, we need to understand that all of those dimensions that we are not necessarily proud of exist within ourselves, and how we, what we do with those elements of ourselves in a meaningful way within our lives. The exercises, just some examples of some of the exercises which I employed in this particular process of getting to grips with the self, is an exercise called the mirror, where it's a visualization exercise in which the performing artist is invited to visualize the face and body naked in a mirror. What do I like about my face and body? What do I dislike? Am I ashamed of? What do I want to hide? Same thing, visualize my psychological makeup. What do I like about it? What do I dislike? Am I ashamed of? Do I want to hide? Visualize my spirit. What do I like about it? What do I dislike? Am I ashamed of? Do I want to hide? And then to go through a process of accepting the positives with thanks and embracing the negatives with grace and gratitude, or making peace with them. They are integral parts of the makeup of the unique self. The performing artist cannot hide them the way they need to be out there on view as full members of the arsenal of the instrument of artistic expression, just as they are full members of the instrument of living, which need to be dealt with in a meaningful manner. Then a very important module in this workshop is what I call the active state of consciousness, both in rehearsal and performance. And this is where I found there's for me some very interesting synergies with logotherapy. So the inciting questions I pose there: what are my blocks, emotional and otherwise, to full artistic or creative expression? What happens when I strive for perfection or try too hard? What levels of active consciousness or self-critical awareness are required of me during the various stages of rehearsal? And what levels of active consciousness, monitoring, or self-critical awareness are required of me during performance? And the logotherapy applications here were hyperreflection versus dereflection, anticipatory anxiety and paradoxical intention, and the spiritual unconscious. And here I'd just like to quote a little bit from Viktor Frankl, from Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning. He says, not only love and moral conscience are rooted in the emotional and intuitive, non-rational depths of the spiritual unconscious, but also what I would call the artistic conscience. Thus, ethics and aesthetics as well have their foundation and basis within the spiritual unconscious. In fact, in his creative work, the artist is dependent on sources and resources deriving from the spiritual unconscious. The non-rational intuition of conscience is paralleled by the inspiration of the artist. Artistic creation emerges out of recesses in a realm that can never be fully illuminated. He goes on to say, we clinicians observe time and again that excessive reflection on the creative process proves to be harmful. Forced self-observation may become a severe handicap to the creativity of the artist. An attempt to produce on a conscious level what must grow in unconscious depths, the attempt to manipulate the primal creative process by reflecting on it, is doomed to failure. We know a case in which a violinist always tried to play as consciously as possible. From putting his violin in place on his shoulder to the most trifling technical detail, he wanted to do everything consciously, to perform in full self-reflection. And this led to a complete artistic breakdown. Therapy had to start with eliminating this tendency to overbearing self-reflection and self-observation, in the terminology of logotherapy, hyperreflection. Therapy had to be aimed at what we call in logotherapy dereflection. Treatment had to give back to the patient his trust in the unconscious by having him realize how much more musical his unconscious was than his conscious. As a matter of fact, this treatment, oriented towards the patient's reliance on his unconscious, brought about the release of the artist's creative powers of his unconscious. Dereflection liberated the creative process from the inhibiting effect. And then I just wrote a little caveat to this. Frankl rightly makes the distinction, albeit indirectly, between reflection and hyperreflection. I would contend that reflection, and possibly even some hyperreflection, is required in the early stages of training and or rehearsal of a new piece, be it music, dance, or acting. but that self-observation must slowly give way over the course of the process of training or rehearsal to de-reflection of the learned behavior. In other words, the building blocks from which the performance is constructed, in order to allow the space for inspiration to show up in front of the audience. So the exercises that I then gave the actors to work on here, I said, take the section of a scene I've been given and focus only on making sure that I'm manifesting the emotion required by the scene that is constantly fully visible and audible to the audience. In other words, hyper-reflect on those elements of the performance. Now take the same scene and forget about the emotion and simply play the situation, that being the de-reflective process. That's also something which people in dance employ a lot. You know, very often the problems that dancers have with choreography is when they hyper-reflect on getting steps right. And very often a choreographer will say, just smile. Imagine smiling at the audience, forget about what your feet are doing and just enjoying yourself. And it's amazing how very often the feet then start to do what is naturally required once that hyper-reflection on getting it right stops. And it's very much the same thing with the actor who is constantly aiming for, I must get that emotion right. I need to get that technical piece. I need to achieve that height at this point. Whereas one is just playing the situation and not focusing on the technical cogs doing the turning. That's when the true inspiration and a performance becomes truly meaningful. Then an exercise around paradoxical intention. What is my worst fear? Forgetting my lines, that I won't find the truth in the moment, that I might fall on stage, etc., which stands in the way of realizing my full potential as an artist. And then the paradoxical, and take that fear and imagine it happening exaggerated 10 times or more, to the point at which the forgetting of the lines, the lack of truth, the pratfall is so ludicrous and ridiculous that it becomes extremely funny. The sting is taken out of the tail of the fear. We cannot be frightened of that which we can laugh at. And we tried it in relation to some fears of the actors on the day. Obviously, it was only possible to take it to a certain point because we didn't have time for those to be tested in front of an audience. But nonetheless, we felt that the technique would be very useful to them going forward. Then this now came the point at which I started to move the focus away from the actor per se and to move towards the actor's relation to what I call character, motivation, and context. And the inciting questions here were, if the process of artistic expression has its origins in the self, where does the process of character analysis originate? And that answer to that is in the text. Within what do all the acting encounters occur, which must be understood in order to make sense of character and motivation? The answer to that question is context. And what does context encompass in preparing for a role? Interesting. Applying logotherapeutic analysis of Athol Fugard's characters in terms of meaning and the tragic triad. Athol Fugard's play being a play about a brother and sister who come together to unpack their lives, and they end up unpacking a whole lot of boxes, searching for some money, which the sister believes is there. Obviously, the unpacking of the box is a metaphorical unpacking of their lives. They are both characters with great meaning, which is why I chose it for this particular workshop. And so the questions which I posed to the actors, given the scenes that they were to work on, were, how can the concepts of meaning and purpose assist me with character analysis? How can the concepts of meaning and purpose assist me to make character choices? How can the concepts of meaning and purpose help me to understand my character's motivations or drives? In other words, what does the character want? Meaning. What happens when the character doesn't get it? Thwarted will to meaning. Is the character's will to meaning based on right choices or not? What does this say about the character's relationship with their conscience as well as about their morality? What do the characters fear? Pain, guilt, and death. How do these fears often manifest in aggression, depression, and or addiction? May I, as the interpreter of the character, ever sit in judgment of that character? Answer, no. Logotherapy applications here with the freedom of will to meaning, meaning in life, the tragic triad of pain, guilt, and death, and aggression, depression, and addiction. So the exercises that I then gave the women and men in relation to the two characters were, for the women, were to create an analysis of Hester Smith, that's the character's name, in Athol Fugard's Hello and Goodbye, based on her thwarted will to meaning in relation to find the money she returned home to claim. She perceives both to have devastated her life, but which is the true thwarted meaning, and which is incorrectly perceived by her as being meaningful? How do these two failures contribute to our sympathy with her as a character, or to our alienation from her? How will I, as the actor playing Hester, ensure that I do not sit in judgment of some aspects of the character as the audience will? And the exercise for the men was create an analysis of Johnny Smith, the male character in Fugard's Hello and Goodbye, based on his fears in relation to his father, pain, guilt, and death, and how these fears manifest in addictive behavior which borders on the bizarre. How does Johnny find a way to persevere with this addictive behavior even after the truth is revealed? Do I believe that Johnny's behavior makes him pitiable? If so, how as the actor playing Johnny will I ensure that he does not lose the audience's sympathy? Pity does not equal compassion, and that they will be moved by his final moments in the play. Perform a short section from one of the character's monologues in which I'm able to manifest some of my character choices based on the above analysis. And then right at the end of the workshop, what I did was then reveal to the workshop participants that they've unknowingly been working with the principles, philosophies, and techniques of logotherapy throughout the day for the purpose of assisting me with my logotherapy research project on the development of logotheatre. So the questions, obviously, that I then dealt with them quite swiftly were, what is logotherapy? Who was Viktor Frankl? What is logotheatre? I shared with them my definition, and a couple of quotes and things. One by Frankl, all psychotherapy is ultimately something of an art, and one of Dr. Chantal's beautiful quotes, logotherapy illuminates the art of living. And then I discussed with him what aspects, philosophies, techniques, and principles of logotherapy have we worked with today. I provided a brief explanation of each and how they were applied to acting and or text and character analysis. And those just again were Socratic dialogue, freedom of will, will to meaning, meaning in life, creative experience and experiential and attitudinal values, filling the existential vacuum, responsibility and meaning, fate versus freedom, the human being as open vessel, physical, psychological, and spiritual dimensions of living and healing, the unconscious God, the spiritual unconscious, attitude modulation, hyper-reflection and dereflection, anticipatory anxiety and paradoxical intention, the tragic triad of pain, guilt, and death, and the aggression, depression, addiction triangle. I then asked if there were any questions, and then I asked them to complete a questionnaire for later handout, which I then collected later. The questions that I have, the questionnaire was worded as follows: thank you for contributing to my studies. Through your participation in my Logotheatre workshop, it's greatly appreciated. Please complete this. The first question was, did you find the workshop informative and engaging? 2, did you find the workshop useful as a performing artist in training? 3, were you easily able to follow the content of the workshop? 4, were you always able to discern the point of each exercise in relation to the subject matter under discussion? 5, were you able to find the answers to the questions posed in the ongoing Socratic dialogue within yourself? 6, had you ever heard of or encountered logotherapy before? 7, did the concepts of meaning and purpose as elucidated in the workshop resonate with you both as a human being and a performing artist? 8, did you find the application of the principles, techniques, and philosophies of logotherapy relevant to the art of life performance? And 9, would you say that the concept of logotheatre is a worthwhile one and worthy of being developed for the mutual benefit of performing artists and therapy clients? And then any other comments. The responses that I had from the students were overwhelmingly positive in terms of all the answers. The academy, the particular academy, has asked me to go back to do some further teaching there based around the principles and the discoveries which were made that day. And obviously, I've now been able to carry some of the discoveries which I made in that workshop on that day forward into the work which I'm now doing on a daily basis at my For Life Center, and which I'm now obviously applying to my research for writing up my research project. So thank you very much for your attention. Apologies once again for the various technical glitches, and yeah, I see we're right at the end of our time, but if there are any questions that anybody has, I'd be happy to answer them, or any comments anyone would like to make. Thank you very much.
I'd like to ask a question.
Yes.
I can't stay that long, so I don't want to like ask and then I'm going to leave soon. But
Okay, sure.
I'm thinking of music as also performing art, which
Yes.
is similar in a way. Where I've always had the question: how do you just let go and forget about yourself when you do have to get it right in order to feel like you're expressing it and not think about it? You have to get the technical things. You do have to get the technical things right first.
Yes.
And how do you manage that? I can never figure that out.
That's why I say, while agreeing completely with Dr. Frankel, that an artist has to give themselves over completely to dereflection and allow inspiration to show up. I believe that the initial part of the process needs to be almost a process of hyper-reflection, in the sense of getting the technical stuff under the belt. In any artistic pursuit, there is always a technical aspect, obviously the learning of the mastering of the instrument, then the learning of the piece as a dancer, the training of the body, the learning of the piece of the choreography as an actor, the training of the instrument, the voice, all those things. And then obviously the learning of the lines and the moves and etc. But once those things are there, to trust, I think, to the muscle memory, which we all know the body has, and to believe that one has put the sufficient building blocks in place to be able then to forget them and to really. So, but no, there always is that. Some people say it's such a percentage perspiration and so much inspiration. I'm inclined to believe that it's kind of 90% perspiration and 10% inspiration in the early stages of the process, and then it gives over to mostly inspiration, hopefully, because if one is going to continue to focus on that thing of getting everything absolutely technically right, you're never getting in touch with allowing your spiritual dimension really to take over and to interpret the piece. That it's kind of moving it away from the psychological and from the physical and the conscious mental process that does need to be engaged in the early stages of the process. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I'm kind of, the question still stands in a way, because what do you do at the early stages when you have to put so much effort into the technical parts? Like you have no choice but to, for the time being, you can't be free yet.
May I say something?
Yeah.
As you ask your question and when Mark was answering, what came into my mind was, how do children learn languages? How do they learn languages? For me, that was the kind of where the answer is. Even walking, how the children start walking, they walk for a purpose. The child walk for a purpose because he needs to stand up and go somewhere. They just walk. The same with speaking languages. The child needs to reach out to other people and express him or herself. They just pick up. Of course, then the other things comes. I'm not saying that the teaching is not important, the practice is not important. Teaching and practice is important, but there is that inner capacity in us. For me, that's the way I would see it. I don't know what Mark would say. The inner capacity we have open for us to learn these things, and it's almost like finding that other person, that other thing in the world one has to reach. I believe with music as well, for one to say, okay, I would like to go and learn music, there should be some kind of love of music. If there is no love for music, I don't know if one is going to learn doing it. So the moment one loves that music, the moment one that finds some kind of experiential values, because we don't appreciate music the same way. That, I think, open up for the person to start answering to what life is offering him. And there is a kind of dialogue and the training happen. I don't know, Mark, what you'd say. I'm not an artist. I'm struggling. Yeah, you know that. Yes.
Well, you know what I said the other day, I believe everybody's an artist to some extent.
Yes.
I think I have a different way of answering the initial question, though, and that is that it's always to some extent about instinct and trusting first instincts and first emotional responses. For example, when I know that I'm going to direct a play that I haven't encountered before, I went through a period in my career where I directed a lot of new plays. And when I sat down to read that play for the first time, even before I decided whether I was going to do it, I would say be sent a play by the management to see if I was interested in directing it. I would always make sure that I was completely alone, that I was not going to be interrupted, and that I was completely focused and in the moment, because I understood that my instinctive emotional response to reading that play could only happen once. In other words, the first time I read it. And so therefore, that absolutely instinctive first emotional response became so important. And it is amazing how often in rehearsal, I will obviously then move miles away from those first responses and explore and experiment with all kinds of other ideas and things that come along, but always somewhere along the line, one returns somewhere, I believe, to those for instinctive responses too. And I think it's the same for any artist, is to trust the hearing a piece of music for the first time, seeing it, seeing the notes for the first time, hearing the music that you're going to be dancing to for the first time, being shown the choreography for the first time, to give oneself completely over at that point to the instinctive emotional response to it, rather than looking at the technique first. Then after you've had those initial emotional responses, which can never be that spontaneous ever again, to then go into the technical exploration and the perfecting of it, and then to return again to the instinct, but an instinct which is obviously now informed by a process of rehearsal and practice and learning. I don't know if that answers the question better.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it does.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
May I, Sandra?
Yes.
Yeah.
And Mike, Mike, I will come to you, please. Yes. Yeah. Go
Okay,
ahead.
thank you. Thank you. In a way, it's an extension of Batya's question, but it's not about the technique. So I would start by saying that I enjoyed your presentation tremendously, and
Thank you.
and most of all, I loved the idea of what you said, that the self is the only vehicle, for the performer, emotional, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, most of all. And my question here, perhaps I have not understood well, but I want to explore that together with you. You also mentioned know thyself, and you also mentioned the term of an open vessel.
Yes.
And later on, when you talked about the courage to look in the mirror and to see what you like in yourself, etc., on all levels, and then what you don't like in yourself, to embrace that, and that the performer has to not hide the sides that he doesn't like about himself, and let himself express that while he's acting, right? And actually, this is very beautiful, because it's exactly the opposite of the original notion of persona, the mask, right?
Yeah.
In Greek theater. So it's very beautiful. But my question here is in relation to logotherapy,
Yes.
is because you're talking about the self with a big S, and Frankl said that the aim of logotherapy is to make the self conscious to itself, right? So my question is, if we are an open vessel, why should we say embrace what you are stuck with? That's who you are. But we are open to change all the time. That's the whole thing. So so know thyself has to do with know your true self, and that's the aim of logotherapy. And then perhaps I'm asking, maybe a better way of saying it is that rather than embracing what you don't like in yourself and not hide it and let it yourself express it on stage, but just work with that. And because you can change it and develop, because it's all a matter of developing your consciousness and coming to higher self-awareness and knowing yourself. And by the way, the original saying in Delphi was know thyself and the gods and the world. So this is indeed your only vehicle.
Yeah, you've actually expressed what I was trying to say much better than I said it. I think so. If I can divide it up into certain areas. So, for example, with the physical self, I think the physical self is where we really encounter the notion of fate versus freedom. You know, that we know how often, you know, when we are asked to name the things that we like about ourselves physically, we are hard pressed to say something, because generally we are kind of, we shouldn't, but name something that you dislike about your body. We've got a list as long as our arm.
Yeah.
And so this thing of kind of accepting and loving really comes into play with that physical. So, for example, if you don't like the way your ears look or your nose looks or whatever, it's kind of, perhaps rather than accepting it, is seeing the beauty in it, which I think is what you're saying in terms of the other things. So it's seeing the potential,
right?
Not so much accepting, but as seeing the beauty within the physical context, seeing the meaning within a more psychological and spiritual context. Also, for me, I think the whole thing about logotherapy not being a problem-based therapy, but being a meaning-based therapy it's also for me, like in logotherapy, in the same way as we don't seek to eradicate the problem, but to learn how to almost live with it in a way which is meaningful. I suppose it's the same way with those kind of things, rather than trying to pretend those sides of us don't exist or the things about ourselves we don't like, is to develop them in a meaningful way, or to live with them meaningfully, or to utilize them, or grow them in a meaningful way. Is that
right?
That clear?
That's beautifully answered.
Beautiful.
So now I understand it much better. I don't know if there is time, but I would also like to ask a very short question. How would you determine in a very short way, maybe just in a sentence, the difference between your approach as theater, logotherapy, or whatever, and drama logotherapy?
I think what drama therapy, and I'm not by any manner of means an expert in it, but drama therapy seeks to almost distance the person from themselves through techniques like role play, where you take on another character and you try and look at your situation objectively as another character. Whereas for me, it's always about the self. And I'm a busy with at the moment where I'm using that. I'm working with Tennessee Williams' play, The Glass Menagerie, with her. Where there is a young teenage girl whose whose trauma mirrors the trauma that this young client of mine is also going through. And rather than, so I'm coming at it from a different angle. I'm saying, don't put yourself into the role of Laura and see yourself as Laura, but what do you recognize in Laura as a character that resonates with you in yourself? So it's really working at it the other way around. I think it's the simplest way of answering it.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very, very much.
Yes, Micah?
Thank you. I've just to relate to your presentation, Mark, I've been doing logo art therapy sessions with a logo art therapist in Finland.
Okay.
And part of the painting sessions was about eliciting the aesthetic conscience, which was, Viktor Frankl talks about the aesthetic conscience, like you mentioned, but questions that the individual asks is, what do you like about this painting? And then the second one is, what do you want to change about it? Because there's something that you can change about it because you can see that this isn't quite right. But then when Viktor Frankl talked about hyperreflection, he was referring to like a pathological type of technicality. And this can be seen even with painting, like what keeps reappearing, like what mistake keeps happening. But if you're too focused on the technical aspects, that it inhibits your performance, then it becomes pathological. So focusing on the technical cogs is simply a means to an end, and we do it in order to fulfill the meaning. And like Viktor Frankl said, in life, there's only one right answer, a unique and singular person in a unique and singular situation. And the technicality is not supposed to be lifeless, but it helps the spiritual to manifest itself in the art form, the tension between what is and what ought to be. And then the pathological technicality would be a misdirected technicality. It's missing the mark. So that was my rambling. But
not rambling. That was so important, and thanks a lot for sharing that. Thanks a lot. It does help us make sense of what we are discussing.
I think
Yes,
just
go ahead.
what was so what you touched on there was the uniqueness, you know, and this is the uniqueness of self, and that even when one applies technique, even the application of technique, even if they're exactly the identical techniques, can never be, two people can never apply them in the same way in a form of artistic expression, I don't believe, because there is always something of the self that is coming into that technique, regardless of it is perfecting a certain brush stroke or a certain step in dance or accessing an emotion in acting. You can never get away from that, the fact that it's always a unique individual who's different from the individual next to you who's performing the same technique. That's something I believe very strongly and work a lot within my work with actors. I will always say, no matter how many Lady Macbeths there are, or Romeos or Juliets or any other famous characters, you know, they can be played by millions of different actors. Two performances can ever be identical.
Thank you. That's so true. Thanks a lot. Any other comment or questions as well? Yes. I personally would. Yes, go ahead, Peter.
Just something funny. Is Batya still here?
It looks like
Batya? Because I need a translation from Hebrew. I'm not sure. I know the word in English, but it's funny when you mentioned the violinist who tries to be so perfect, etc., etc. There is a beautiful story, a Chinese story about the you call it a 1,000-legged you know, something that crawls on the floor. How do you call it? A little animal that
Oh,
crawls.
a centipede.
Yeah, centipede, exactly. I just wanted Batya to translate for me. A centipede, exactly. So there is a joke,
Yes.
Chinese joke, that if you ask the centipede, how do you know how to manage all your 1,000 legs and walk? And he said, if I would start asking every one of my legs, I would be stuck. I won't be able to walk at all.
I would
So,
never make a step. Yeah, that's beautiful. I'd forgotten about that beautiful story.
Yeah, so that's exactly the spontaneity that violinist is actually stacking himself. And there is even a more beautiful story. I don't know, remember if Frankel tells it or somebody else, that an actor was trying to be so perfect that he went so far as to look himself in the mirror when something tragic happened in his family. I don't remember whether his daughter died or something like that. And he said, let's catch my face at this moment. And he looked in the mirror. And that is so absurd. That is so absurd. That is like stopping life in the name of something like, which is performance. And actually from your whole talk, I would say we can better call it encounter rather than performance, because something in performance is saying something like that you are playing a role, you are performing, whereas encounter is you're just being real, you're being yourself.
Yeah. I will never allow an actor to work in front of a mirror. And I have an exercise that I do with actors when they first start working, which is very interesting. I'll say to them, and I'll do it on camera. I put a close up on their face, and I'll throw a bunch of emotions at them, and I'll say, without thinking, just express this emotion: anger, fear, terror. You know, and they go, and you get all of that going. And then I say, how do you think you did with that? And I say, well, I've given you an impossible exercise, because there is no such thing as anger, fear, terror. Just like color, if you tell someone to paint your room green, do they know what color they're going to paint it? No, because there are millions of shades of green, just like there are millions of shades of emotion. And an emotion cannot exist without a context. So then I take that same exercise and I say, right, take one of those emotions, for example, anger, when you were pulling your face, and just place yourself back in a situation, contextualize it as fully as you can. Where were you? What did it look like? What was the weather like? Were there any smells? Was there music in the background? Who was the person with you with? In other words, really try and get yourself to the place of feeling exactly how. And all you're going to do this time is you're just going to look into that camera and you're going to just feel the emotion. And you will be, it is unbelievable the things that you then see happening on faces, the little twitches of the muscles, and not only the face. Obviously, we always act with the whole body, even if we're just focused on the face. The foot is twitching or doing something, and screw up your eyes at that point, or to purse your mouth. And they say, no, I didn't paint anything. I was just sitting in the moment on the emotion. I'd say, well, there you go. That's what's happening. The face, the voice, the body will manifest exactly what it needs to if the emotion is truthful in the moment.
Yeah, for me, Mark, thank you very much again for this beautiful presentation. It might have looked very long, but you have seen people have stayed up to the end of it to tell you how important it is and how relevant it is. And for me, you said you said many things, but I just want to say two things to encourage you continue doing this, because this is so much important, so much relevant in our time. You know the situation in South Africa. We need this kind of work to heal our community. And this is not only in South Africa, it's all over the world. I'm definitely sure that we would need this kind of work. The second thing is I totally agree with you. Logotherapy and art therapy when one talk of art therapy, generally you have all these other school of thoughts, but not logotherapy. So I'm definitely sure that your work is helping to bring the voice of logotherapy in that big arena of discussing and contributing to art therapy, which is very much needed in our health system. Having said that, unless anyone would like to come up with a comment or a question, I'd like to say thank you to you again, and I'm looking forward to having another presentation, having more discussion with you, and yeah, thanks to everyone as well for attending this meeting with us. Thank you.